The day Olive Redmond realized she had been left behind was the same day she understood exactly how little she had mattered to the men she had trusted with her life. The sun hung merciless and white over the Sonoran Desert, pressing down on the cracked earth like a branding iron held too long against hide. It was the summer of 1874, and the heat of southern Arizona territory was not the gentle warmth of a hearth fire, but the open-mouthed fury of something that wanted to consume everything it touched. Olive stood at the edge of a dry creek bed, her traveling trunk split open in the red dust, her water canteen nearly empty, and not a single living soul within view in any direction she turned. The cattle drive she had attached herself to 32 longhorns, 4 drovers, and one thoroughly untrustworthy trail boss named Cal Pruett had moved on without her sometime in the deep blue hours before dawn, and she had not even heard them go. She had been sleeping beneath the canvas lean, till she had fashioned herself from a spare bedroll and 2 mesquite branches, the kind of improvised shelter that said everything about her situation. She was not a drover. She was not even a ranch hand. She was a schoolteacher from Tucson, 24 years old, with ink-stained fingers and a trunk full of books and chalk, trying to reach the settlement of Mariposa Wells where the territorial school board had promised her a classroom, a small stipend, and a life that was entirely her own. She had paid Cal Pruett $12, nearly a month's wages, to let her travel with the drive as far as the split at Copper Ridge, where she would pick up the main wagon road south. Pruett had taken the money. He had taken everything. Standing in that burning morning light, Olive turned a slow circle and tried to breathe steadily. She had 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, less than a quarter canteen of water, and about 6 miles between her and an uncertain fate. The cattle tracks moved southeast, which was not her direction. The land around her was a vast, indifferent theater of saguaro cactus and pale rock, and it said nothing to her questions. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had grown up in Santa Fe, the daughter of a Methodist minister who believed that hardship was God's curriculum, and she had learned to read the desert the way other girls learned embroidery. She knew that panic killed faster than thirst. She knew that morning was the only kind time the desert offered, and that by midday the air would become something close to liquid fire. She took her remaining water, drank half of it in slow, deliberate swallows, and then she started walking. She walked east along the dry creek bed because dry creek beds in Arizona had a habit of leading somewhere eventually, even if that somewhere was just a memory of water. Her trunk was too heavy to carry, so she took what mattered most: the books, her leather satchel, the letters of appointment from the school board, and a small folding knife her father had pressed into her hands the morning she left Santa Fe. Everything else she left for the desert to swallow. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, and the sun had climbed high enough to make the air shimmer like a fevered dream when she heard the sound of hooves. She stopped walking. She turned toward the sound and shaded her eyes with one hand, and out of the silver haze of the heat, a single rider materialized on the ridge above the creek bed. He was moving at an easy trot, heading northeast, clearly on his own trajectory with no intention of deviating from it. He was too far away for her to read his face, but she could see the shape of him, broad-shouldered, hat low, a pack-horse trailing behind him on a lead rope. She understood immediately that he was going to pass her by. The angle of his path would carry him perhaps 100 yards to her north, and she was a small figure in a large landscape, and he was a man with somewhere to be. Every rational instinct she possessed told her that a woman alone in the desert flagging down a strange rider was a gamble whose odds she could not calculate. She did it anyway. She pulled the pale blue cotton of her blouse from her satchel. She had packed a change of clothes in the bag, thank God, and she waved it over her head with both arms, moving in wide, desperate arcs, and she shouted. Her voice came out raw and cracked from the dryness of the air, but she shouted his direction with everything she had. The rider pulled his horse to a stop. He sat there for a long moment, absolutely still, and she could almost feel his calculation from across the distance. Then slowly, he turned his horse and began moving toward her. Tobias Townsend had been riding the same stretch of Arizona desert for 3 years, long enough to know every shade of trouble the territory could produce, and long enough to know that a woman alone in the middle of the Sonoran at 10 in the morning in July was the kind of sight that rearranged a man's plans whether he wanted it to or not. He had his own destination, his own schedule, and about 40 miles of hard country between him and the town of Mariposa Wells, where a friend owed him a conversation and possibly a job. He was not supposed to stop. He knew he was not supposed to stop. His trail boss instincts, honed over 8 years of pushing cattle across 3 territories, told him that stopping for unknowns cost time and sometimes blood. He stopped anyway. As he rode closer, he watched the woman lower the blue cloth she had been waving and hold herself very still in the way that people did when they were trying not to show how frightened they were. She was dressed practically, which he appreciated. A heavy cotton skirt, lace-up boots with real soles, a hat that was doing its best work against the sun. Her dark hair was pinned but coming loose in the heat. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder and she was clutching it with both hands, and even from 20 yards away he could see the deliberate steadiness of her breathing. He pulled Jasper, his big roan gelding, to a halt about 10 feet from her and tipped his hat brim up enough to see her clearly. She was younger than he had initially estimated, mid-20s probably, with dark eyes that were doing a thorough, efficient job of assessing him right back. Her face was sunburned across the nose and cheekbones. She had the look of someone who was holding a great deal together through sheer will. "You alone out here," he said. "I am now," she said, and her voice was dry but steady. "I was traveling with a cattle drive. The trail boss left without me this morning." Tobias took off his hat and dragged the back of his wrist across his forehead. "Cal Pruett's drive," her eyes sharpened. "You know him." "I know his reputation, which is not a comfortable thing to know." He looked at her satchel, her lack of any other visible belongings, the empty expanse of desert around her. "Where were you headed?" "Mariposa Wells. I am the new school teacher." He was quiet for a moment, then he put his hat back on. "That's where I'm headed." She looked at him with the measured wariness of a woman who had already been burned once today by a man offering solutions. "Is that a coincidence or a convenience?" He almost smiled. It was the kind of question that told you something real about a person. "Both, probably. My name is Tobias Townsend. I have been riding for the last 5 years without leaving anyone in the desert, if that is a useful piece of history." She looked at him for another long moment. The sun was fully savage now, and even standing still was a kind of slow punishment. He watched her make the calculation that most people in her situation had to make: the known danger of the desert alone versus the unknown quantity of a stranger, and he watched her come to the only sensible conclusion. "Olive Redmond," she said, "and I would be grateful for a ride." He dismounted and offered her Jasper's back without ceremony. She swung up with more ease than he expected, settling herself in the saddle like someone who had ridden before, and he lashed her satchel to the packhorse's load. Then he took Jasper's reins and led him forward, walking, because the horse was carrying double weight in desert heat, and Tobias was the larger sacrifice to make. "You do not have to walk," Olive said from above him. "Jasper has been carrying my pack since sunup," he said. "He deserves a lighter load for a stretch." She was quiet for a moment. "The packhorse could carry me. Pepper has a trick knee. She goes sideways on a rider and there is nothing to grab onto." Another pause. "That seems like a dangerous packhorse." "She has her virtues," he said. "She has never once abandoned anyone in the desert." He heard Olive make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was cousin to one. "That is a very specific virtue." They walked in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, Tobias leading both horses along the creek bed as the heat climbed and the saguaros threw their thin morning shadows eastward. He gave her his water canteen, which was full, and told her to drink in regular intervals. She did as he said without argument, which told him she was sensible enough to override her pride when her survival was the alternative. After a while she said, "How far to Mariposa Wells?" 40 miles. "But there is a relay station at Agua Dulce about 12 miles from here. We will stop there for the midday heat and water the horses. And after that, we ride the last stretch in the late afternoon and evening when it is cooler. We should reach Mariposa Wells by midnight, maybe a little after." She absorbed this. "You seem very certain of this route." "I have ridden it before. The desert between here and Agua Dulce is straightforward. After that there is one stretch of rough country near Copper Ridge, but the road is clear." "Copper Ridge," she said. "That is where I was supposed to rejoin the main road." "Pruett took you 40 miles out of your way before he left you," Tobias said, and there was something flat and certain in his voice that was not quite anger but was next to it. "If you had tried to walk to the main road from here, you would not have made it in this heat." She was quiet for a long time after that. They arrived at the Agua Dulce relay station in the early afternoon, a low adobe building with a ramada out front, a trough, and a man named Santos who ran the place with 2 horses of his own and a surprisingly well-stocked larder. Santos knew Tobias by name, shook his hand, and gave Olive a long appraising look that contained neither threat nor impropriety, only the particular assessment of a man who had seen a great many travelers come through and could read their stories at a glance. "You found her in the desert," Santos said to Tobias in the easy way of men who have known each other across years of shared territory. "She found me," Tobias said. "She flagged me down." Santos looked at Olive with something closer to respect. "Smart woman." "Thank you," Olive said, and she meant it without embellishment. Inside the relay station, out of the hammer of the afternoon sun, Olive ate cold beans and cornbread and drank water until she felt human again. And Tobias sat across the plank table from her and ate his own meal in the straightforward way of men who had learned not to stand on ceremony in working country. He was 30 years old, she gathered. She was not certain how she gathered this, perhaps from the way he moved, with the settled confidence of someone who had finished growing into himself. He was not tall in the theatrical way of some cowboys she had seen, but he was solid, built close to the earth, with hands that were broad-palmed and careful, and a face that had been worked over thoroughly by weather and sun, and something that might have been private thought. He did not talk much, but when he talked, he said things that had weight. She asked him about the job in Mariposa Wells. He told her unhurriedly that a rancher named Hollis Crane had written to him about managing a cattle operation, not a drive but a home ranch permanent work, the kind of thing that meant staying in one place for more than a season. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Staying in one place." He looked at her from across the table. The light in the relay station was dim and amber, coming through one small window, and it made his eyes look darker than they probably were. "I am starting to think about it," he said. "I have been moving for a long time." She understood that kind of answer, the kind that was more personal than the question asked for, offered quietly, without drama, as though the speaker was not entirely sure why they were saying it aloud. She told him about Santa Fe and her father and the school board appointment. She told him about the classroom she had not yet seen, the students she had not yet met, the particular dream of a life that was hers and no one else's. Not her father's ministry, not the expectations of a society that thought women her age should be married and settled rather than teaching multiplication tables in an Arizona frontier town. "You chose this yourself," he said. "It was not a question." "Entirely," she said. He nodded slowly, the way men nod when they are genuinely receiving what you have said rather than merely waiting for their turn to speak. "Good," he said. "It is better when things are chosen." They left Agua Dulce in the late afternoon, when the sun had dropped low enough to lose some of its killing power, and now Tobias rode beside Olive on Jasper while she rode Pepper, whose trick knee behaved itself, as it apparently usually did when the animal was in good spirits. The desert in the late afternoon was a different country than the desert at midday. The light went amber and then orange, and the saguaros cast long, dramatic shadows, and the air lost its edge of violence and became something almost gentle. They talked as they rode. Not constantly, there were long stretches of comfortable quiet, but with the ease of people who had already, without planning it, moved past the need for social performance. She told him about a book she had read 3 times, a novel about a woman who walked across Scotland alone. He told her about a cattle drive in New Mexico territory 2 years ago when they had pushed 300 head through a flash flood, and he had lost a horse and nearly lost a drover. She asked if the drover was all right. He said yes, and that the man had gone on to open a livery stable in Albuquerque. She laughed at that, a real, full laugh that surprised them both. "What is funny?" he asked, though he was almost smiling himself. "A man survives a flood with 300 cattle and ends up shoeing horses in Albuquerque," she said. "I do not know why that strikes me as perfect, but it does." He did smile then, and it changed his face considerably. It made him look younger and somewhat undone, as though the smile was a thing he did not wear often enough for it to sit comfortably. Night came down over the desert like a velvet cloth laid by careful hands, and the stars appeared in numbers that the crowded cities back east would have found impossible to believe. Out here in the Arizona territory, in the summer of 1874, there was no competition from lamplit streets, no haze of industry, and the sky above was a pure, extravagant display that felt almost personal. Olive had grown up under these skies and still found herself looking up with something close to reverence. They stopped once to rest the horses and let them graze on a sparse patch of desert grass near a seep spring that Tobias seemed to know existed from memory. The water was cool and slightly mineral, and the horses drank deeply. Olive sat on a flat rock and looked up at the stars and felt, for the first time since the horrible clarity of the morning, that things were going to be all right. Tobias came and sat on a rock nearby, not crowding her space but close enough for conversation. He had his hat off and his dark hair was slightly disheveled from the long day's riding. He was looking at the stars too, with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that private, internal thing he did when he was thinking about something that mattered. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When you saw me this morning, you were on your way somewhere. You were not going to stop." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I was not." "What made you stop?" He turned and looked at her directly, which was a thing he did rarely enough that it always meant something. "You were alone in the desert in July," he said. "There was not a choice to make." "There was," she said. "There is always a choice. Most people keep riding." "Most people are wrong," he said simply, and then he looked back up at the stars. She held that answer for a while, and found it was the kind she wanted to keep. They reached Mariposa Wells at 1:15 midnight, arriving in the way that trail-worn travelers always arrived, quietly, dustily, with the profound relief of people who had been tested by geography and endured. The town was small but real, a main street of perhaps 8 buildings, a livery, a general store, a saloon showing one lit window, and the clean dark shapes of houses set back from the road. It smelled of horse and wood smoke and the faint mineral sweetness of the desert at night. The livery was staffed by a sleepy young man who roused himself sufficiently to take the horses without complaint. Tobias paid him and shouldered the supply bags from the pack horse. Olive stood on the street in Mariposa Wells for the first time and felt the particular complicated emotion of arrival, the satisfaction of being somewhere, undercut by the sudden awareness that being somewhere meant the journey was over. The hotel, a 2-story adobe called the Territorial House, had a night attendant who gave Olive a room on the 2nd floor without asking unnecessary questions. Tobias took a room as well, on the 1st floor near the back. They stood in the small lobby in the lamplight, and the moment was an odd one, full of the awareness that the shared necessity of the day was over and they were now simply 2 people in a town. "Thank you," Olive said. She meant it with the full weight of someone who understood exactly what they were grateful for. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not stopped." "You would have found another way," he said. "You are the kind of person who finds another way." She looked at him. "That is very generous." "It is accurate," he said. She smiled, the soft kind, the one that comes up before you think to manage it. "Good night, Tobias." "Good night, Olive." She climbed the stairs to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the night sounds of Mariposa Wells, the distant coyote, the creak of the building in the desert wind. And she thought about a man who had stopped when he was supposed to keep writing, and she found she was smiling again without meaning to. The next morning she met with the school board, which consisted of 3 men, a rancher, the general store owner, and the local minister, who examined her letters of appointment and her credentials with the gravity of men making a significant decision. They approved her employment, showed her the schoolhouse, 1 room, 12 desks, a chalkboard that had seen better days and 2 good windows, and told her she would have a week to settle before the first students arrived in August. She found a room to rent at the home of a widow named Mrs. Clara Fitch, a formidable woman of 60 who had outlasted 2 husbands and a drought, and ran her household with the precision of a military campaign. The room was clean and light and had a view of the street, and Mrs. Fitch charged a fair rate and included supper. She saw Tobias that same afternoon. He was coming out of the general store as she was going in, and they nearly walked into each other, and both of them stepped back at the same moment, and then both of them laughed. "You found lodgings?" he asked. "Mrs. Fitch's house on Cactus Street," she said. "You?" "I met with Holly's Crane this morning. He has offered me the foreman position at his ranch." A pause. "I accepted." She registered this information with more pleasure than was strictly sensible. "So you are staying?" "I am staying," he confirmed. There was something in the way he said it that felt less like an announcement and more like a statement of intent that went beyond the job. But she did not press it, and he did not elaborate, and they went their separate ways with the knowledge sitting between them like a warm coal. Mariposa Wells in the summer of 1874 was the particular kind of place that was still deciding what it wanted to be. It sat at the edge of genuinely wild country, Apache territory to the east, Mexican border country to the south, and the long arm of American expansion pressing in from every other direction. The town had approximately 200 residents, a population that included Mexican families who had lived in that valley for generations before the town had a name, Anglo settlers who had arrived in the last decade, with varying degrees of entitlement and varying degrees of decency, and a scattering of others who had ended up there through the complicated mathematics of frontier life. Olive, who had grown up in Santa Fe with its mix of cultures and histories, found Mariposa Wells recognizable in its tensions. She heard the way some of the Anglo families talked about the Mexican families, with a casual dismissiveness that made her jaw tighten. She watched the way the town's social arrangements hardened around certain unspoken rules, and she filed these observations away with the patience of someone who knew that schoolteachers could do more good from inside a community than from outside it. Her school opened on the first Monday of August with 11 students between the ages of 6 and 14, 5 Anglo children and 6 children from the Mexican families in town, which was apparently more integration than the school had attempted in previous years under its last teacher, a man who had left somewhat abruptly. Olive looked at those 11 faces on that first morning and felt the specific electricity of a purpose that fit exactly the shape of you. She was not naive. She knew 2 of the Anglo parents had already knocked on Mrs. Fitch's door to express their reservations about the seating arrangements. Mrs. Fitch had told them something in Spanish that Olive suspected was impolite and shut the door. The school proceeded. Tobias, in those first weeks, was a constant but quiet presence at the edges of her settling in. He was at the Crane Ranch most days from before sunup to after sundown, but Mariposa Wells was not a large place, and there were evenings when he came into town for supplies or to conduct business, and they would find themselves in the same orbit. He was not a man who manufactured reasons to see her, and she found she respected that. The reasons arrived naturally, which was more interesting. He brought her a box of chalk in the second week of August because he had heard from someone. She strongly suspected Mrs. Fitch, who seemed to have appointed herself a silent coordinator of Olive's well-being, that the school had run out. He left it on the front step of the schoolhouse with a note that said simply, "Found these at the dry goods in Tucson." She stood in the schoolhouse door holding the box of chalk and the note, and felt something she was not quite ready to name. He came to the school social in late August, an event organized by the town ladies to welcome the new teacher, and stood near the back of the community hall with his hat in his hands, which she found endearing. He was not a social creature, she had observed, at least not in the formal sense. He spoke to people with genuine warmth when he was speaking to them, but he did not work a room. He did not perform. She crossed the hall to where he stood and said, "You look like a man counting the minutes." "I am not," he said, which was honest if perhaps not the full story. "Would you like some cake? Mrs. Ray's made the walnut cake and it is extraordinary." "I would," he said. They stood together near the back wall with slices of walnut cake, and he asked her how the school was going, and she told him about a boy named Felipe who had come in able to speak 3 languages and read in none of them and was now, 3 weeks in, decoding simple sentences with the focused intensity of someone cracking a very satisfying puzzle. She talked about her students the way some people talk about their children, with the mix of pride and worry and delight that meant genuine investment. Tobias listened. He asked questions that were specific and thoughtful, not the polite, glancing questions of social obligation, but the real ones that said he had heard what she actually told him and wanted to know more. She noticed this. She noticed everything about him, if she was honest with herself, with increasing attention that she mostly kept organized into tidy, sensible categories. One evening in September, they rode out together, not by design, but by the coincidence of both leaving town at the same time heading the same direction. She was going to look at a section of the creek road she had heard the school board mention as a possible route for the students who lived east of town. He was going to check a fence line at the eastern edge of the Crane property. They fell into step beside each other on the trail and were quiet for a long, easy while. The desert in September was beginning to soften from its summer savagery. The monsoon rains had come through, and the saguaros were swollen and green, and the ground had erupted in low flowering plants that bloomed furiously in the brief wet window before the dry returned. The light was different, lower, more golden, with a quality of attention that summer's harsh white glare never had. "Do you miss moving?" she asked him, thinking of what he had told her that first day about being in motion for a long time. He was quiet for a moment. "Less and less," he said. He glanced over at her. "There are things that make staying feel like the better thing." The sentence hung in the air between them. She did not look away from the trail ahead, but she felt it, the warm, precise weight of what he had not quite said. "Like the work at the Crane Ranch," she offered carefully. "Among other things," he said just as carefully. She thought about that for the rest of the ride, and for a considerable portion of the evening. October came in cool and gold, and the desert reinvented itself with the shameless extravagance it always managed when the worst of the heat was done. Olive's school was now running smoothly enough that she had begun adding afternoon sessions for the older students, working through geography and history and rudimentary science, subjects the school board had not explicitly asked for but had not forbidden either. One Thursday afternoon, 2 of the older boys, Anglo boys, both 13, had been unkind to a younger student named Miguel, who was 7 and had arrived that week not speaking more than a few words of English. Olive had addressed it directly, which meant she had stood in front of the whole class and said clearly that her school was not a place where anyone would be made small because of the language they came from. The boys' fathers heard about this. One of them came to the school the following morning. She was alone in the schoolhouse when he arrived, a man named Garth Hadley, broad and red-faced and certain of himself, who stood in the doorway of her classroom and told her that she needed to understand how things worked in Mariposa Wells and that she had not been hired to take the part of Mexican children over American ones. She stood behind her desk and looked at him steadily. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were still. "Every child in my classroom is American," she said. "And my classroom is mine to run as I see fit, within the guidelines of the school board, of which you are not a member." He was not a man who liked being spoken to that way, particularly by a woman, particularly in a schoolhouse. He said several more things, increasingly large, and she waited for all of them to run out, and then she said, "I think we are finished here, Mr. Hadley. Goodbye." He left, and she sat down very quietly at her desk and breathed carefully for several minutes. She told Tobias about it that evening. She had not planned to. They had simply met, as they often did by that point, at the general store at the end of the day, both of them on errands, and it came out as she was telling him about the afternoon. She was not asking for rescue, and she said so explicitly, "I am telling you because it happened, not because I need someone to fight it for me." He looked at her seriously. "I know that," he said. "You handled it." "I did." "Hadley is a man who is used to being the loudest thing in the room," Tobias said. "He backs down when he meets something that does not move." She let out a long breath. "I hope so." "He will not bother you again," Tobias said, with a quiet certainty that she found both comforting and interesting, given that he had not done anything except listen. Garth Hadley did not, in fact, bother her again. Whether this was because of her own stand or because of something that Tobias had said during a conversation she was never fully informed about, she could not be certain. But she had her suspicions, and she decided they were good ones. By November, the thing between them had developed to the point where they both knew it was a thing, even though neither of them had put words to it. Mariposa Wells was a small town, and small towns had opinions, and Mrs. Fitch had begun making pointed references to the availability of the parlor on weekend evenings, which was her way of providing appropriate supervised social space without being asked. On a Saturday evening in early November, Tobias came to supper at Mrs. Fitch's, a proper sit-down supper that Mrs. Fitch presided over with the authority of a woman who considered the table a sacred institution. There was pot roast and root vegetables and dried apple pie and coffee so strong it could cut wood, and the four of them, Mrs. Fitch, her daughter who was visiting from Tucson, Olive, and Tobias, sat around the table for the better part of 2 hours. Olive watched Tobias navigate Mrs. Fitch's kitchen table, which was a test in its own right. He was polite without being sycophantic, spoke to Mrs. Fitch's daughter with genuine interest when she talked about her work as a seamstress, and when the conversation turned to the Apache troubles in the Eastern Territory, he said plainly that the troubles were largely the result of a government that had made promises it did not keep, which silenced the table briefly, but which Olive found completely accurate. Mrs. Fitch looked at him over her coffee cup with an expression that said she had just upgraded her assessment of him. After supper, he and Olive sat in the parlor while Mrs. Fitch and her daughter washed up, and the house was warm with the last of October's heat leaking through the thick adobe walls, and the lamp between them sent up a steady yellow flame. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. He had his forearms resting on his knees, leaning slightly forward, that hat of his hanging on the hook by the door because Mrs. Fitch had a rule about hats indoors. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you are willing." She studied his face, which was doing that earnest, slightly uncertain thing it did when he was saying something that mattered to him. He was not a man who performed confidence he did not feel, which was one of the most attractive things about him. "I think I am willing," she said. "I think I have been waiting for you to ask." Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the way a door opens, quietly with an alteration of light. "I should have asked sooner," he said. "You asked when you were ready," she said. "I find that I prefer that." The courtship of Tobias Townsend and Olive Redmond proceeded as the best things in the desert proceeded. Not with sudden storm, but with the patient accumulation of water in a dry place, until what had been empty was full, and it seemed impossible that it had ever been otherwise. He came to supper at Mrs. Fitch's twice a week. She visited the Crane Ranch on Sunday afternoons, where she met Holly's Crane, a gruff, big-handed man in his 50s, who had the decency to greet her without condescension, and saw the country Tobias was learning to call home. They rode together in the evenings when the light was good, not always talking, often comfortable in the particular quiet that two people share when they have stopped needing to fill the space. He told her about his life in pieces, the way people do when they trust carefully because they have learned that trust costs something. He had grown up in West Texas, the youngest of 3 boys, on a ranch that had been his father's and his father's father's, until the bank had taken it when Tobias was 17 and the cattle market had collapsed. He had been moving since then. 8 years of cattle drives, 3 territories, and the particular loneliness of a man who has learned to sleep light because home is temporary. She listened to all of it. She asked the right questions and did not offer comfort he had not asked for, and when he was done she said, "You have been very careful with yourself." He looked at her. "Too careful, maybe." "Maybe," she agreed. "But careful is not the same as closed." He was quiet for a moment. "You are very clear-eyed," he said. "I spent years in a house with a minister and a large library," she said. "You develop opinions." He smiled. He had been smiling more lately, and it was still the kind of smile that changed his face in ways she found she wanted to keep seeing. December arrived with the particular dry cold of the Arizona high desert, the kind that cracked lips and frosted the saguaros at night and made the mornings brilliant and sharp. School was going well enough that Olive had petitioned the school board for a second reader and a set of arithmetic primers, and to her moderate surprise they had agreed. Felipe could now read in English with a fluency that delighted him and impressed everyone who had doubted it. Miguel had stopped hanging back at the edge of the schoolyard and was running races with the older boys at lunch. Olive considered these facts to be among the best things she had accomplished in her life. On a Sunday in mid-December, she and Tobias were riding the ridge road above town, a trail that gave a long view south toward Mexico, the land rolling away in tawny waves to the horizon, when he pulled Jasper to a stop and sat for a moment looking out over that enormous view. She stopped Pepper beside him. The cold air was clean, and the sky was the hard, specific blue of winter desert, and there was no sound except the wind moving through the brush below. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly because I am not always good at being clear." She waited. He turned and looked at her. The winter light was on his face, and she could see him very well, and what she saw was a man who had arrived at something after a long journey. "I have not wanted to stay anywhere in a long time," he said, "and I have been trying to understand whether that has changed because of the work, or because of the place, or because of you." He paused. "It is you, Olive. It is entirely you." The wind moved between them, and the horses were patient and still. "I am not in a hurry," he continued. "I know we have not known each other long in calendar time. But I have known you in the way that matters, and I think you know me the same way, and I would like you to know that I intend to be here, permanently, not just at the Crane Ranch, here in your life if that is something you want." She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she could have said that would have been careful and sensible, and would have kept the careful distance that a woman in her position was generally advised to maintain. She had been advised, in Santa Fe and Tucson, and a dozen conversations with women who meant well, to be measured with her heart. She thought about all of that and found that in the face of Tobias Townsend sitting on a ridge in December saying the truest thing she had heard in years, the careful advice had nothing useful to offer her. "It is something I want," she said. "It has been something I want for a while." He reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat on the ridge above Mariposa Wells with the whole of the Southwest spread before them and held on. The months that followed were the kind of months that built something real and lasting between two people, not the heady, disorienting rush of new love, though there was some of that, but the deeper business of becoming known. Tobias met the full collection of Olive's opinions about history and politics and the territorial education system, which were numerous and strongly held. She met the full collection of his silences, his habits, his particular loyalty to the horses in his care, and the way he woke before dawn every morning not because he had to, but because he had done it so long that the habit had become a form of identity. They argued once, genuinely, in February, over something that began as a disagreement about a decision the school board had made and became something more personal when she said she did not want anyone making decisions that affected her work without her at the table. And he said he understood that, but he had only been trying to help. And she said she knew he had been trying to help, but that help offered without consultation was not always helpful. And there was a long, uncomfortable silence during which both of them sat with the discomfort rather than collapsing it too quickly. Then Tobias said, "You are right. I should have asked you first. I am sorry." And Olive said, "I know you meant well. I should have heard that first before I was annoyed." And they moved on from it with the particular grace of two people who have enough respect for each other to let the argument be real and then be over. Spring came to Mariposa Wells in late February, the desert spring that was less about flowers and more about light, the way the sun shifted its angle, and the days lengthened imperceptibly, and the morning air lost its hard edge and became something that encouraged plans. Tobias had been promoted at the Crane Ranch. Holly's Crane, who was getting older and whose health was beginning to require accommodation, had offered him a larger share of the operation, a partnership stake, which was a significant thing and which Tobias had sat with carefully before accepting. He told Olive about it over supper at Mrs. Fitch's, and she could see the controlled excitement in him, the thing he kept contained because he did not want to be disappointed by it if it went wrong. "It will not go wrong," she said. "You cannot know that." "No," she admitted, "but I know you, and I know what you do with the things you commit to." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in that moment that was very full. They were married in April of 1875, on a Thursday morning that came in clear and warm, with the whole desert smelling of rain from the night before and the flowering ocotillo blazing red along the road to the small church at the edge of town. Mrs. Fitch cried, though she would have denied it if pressed. Felipe and Miguel sat in the front pew because Olive had insisted. Holly's Crane was there, big and upright in his best coat, looking satisfied in the way of men who have seen a good hand play out. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Morrison, who kept it simple and true. The vows were the traditional ones, and when they were said they felt neither small nor ceremonial. They felt earned, the way things feel when they are the result of real consideration rather than convention alone. Tobias Townsend stood at the front of that small church and looked at Olive Redmond coming toward him in a dress the color of cream, her dark hair pinned with desert flowers, and the expression on his face was the one she had been keeping in her memory since that first day on the ridge in December, the open, undone one, the one that said he was not managing himself but simply feeling what he felt. She reached him and took his hand. "Hello," she said quietly, which was not part of the ceremony, just something she needed to say. "Hello," he said back, and smiled the smile she had not yet finished cataloging. They settled into a life that was practical and warm and full of the particular richness of two people who had chosen deliberately. The Crane Ranch provided them a house, a solid adobe structure on the north end of the property, 2 rooms growing to 3 over the course of a year, as Tobias built an addition with help from Santos from the relay station, who turned out to be a skilled carpenter, and who came up for a week in the fall and left behind a kitchen extension and a proper pantry. Olive continued to teach. She had made it clear before the wedding, and Tobias had made it clear to everyone who needed to hear it that this was not a point of negotiation. Her school grew in the second year to 15 students and a waiting list, and the school board, faced with evidence they could not dismiss, approved a second part-time teaching assistant, a young woman named Anna Reyes. the daughter of the woman who had made the walnut cake at the community social, who was sharp and patient and wonderful with the youngest children. In the summer of 1875, Olive became pregnant with their first child. She told Tobias on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table in the house on the Crane property, with coffee between them and the desert light coming early and golden through the east window. She told him matter-of-factly, the way she did most important things, and watched his face change through several things very quickly: surprise, then a kind of large quiet wonder, then the smile that was still undoing her, still the same, still the one that did not fit comfortably on his face because he wore it so genuinely. He reached across the table and took both her hands. He did not say anything for a moment. When he did speak, his voice was lower than usual. How are you feeling?" "Good," she said. "Tired, but good." "We will need to talk to Mrs. Fitch," he said, which made no immediate sense. She laughed. "Why Mrs. Fitch?" "Because she will know everything that needs to be done, and she will be deeply offended if she is not told immediately," he said. He was not wrong about this. Mrs. Fitch received the news with the efficient gravity of a woman who had been waiting for it and immediately began producing practical advice, a knitting project, and a casserole. Their son was born in the early spring of 1876, on a wild and windy March night when the whole desert was howling with a late winter storm, and the midwife, a capable woman named Dolers who had delivered half the children in Mariposa Wells, arrived at their door in a state that said she had ridden through interesting conditions to be there. The birth was not easy. Nothing that mattered was ever entirely easy, but it was not frightening either. Dolers was excellent at her work. Tobias spent most of that night in the front room, not because he had been banished, but because Olive, in the particular intensity of labor, had told him firmly that she needed to concentrate, and that his concern, while appreciated, was a distraction. He had accepted this with the grace of a man who understood that sometimes the best thing he could do was trust the people who knew more than he did. When Dolers came to get him, he followed her into the back room, and Olive was sitting up in the bed with the newborn in the crook of her arm, and she looked tired in the beautiful, foundational way of someone who has done something immense and come through it. The baby was small and red and had his father's dark hair, which Tobias noticed first. "He is well," Tobias said, which came out a little rough. "He is well," Dolers said, already packing her bag with the efficiency of a woman whose work was done. "Mother is well. Everyone is well." Tobias sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was asleep, and then looked at Olive, who was looking at him. "What do you want to call him?" she asked. They had discussed names at length and had a short list. He had privately been leaning toward one. "James," he said, "after your father." She looked at him with an expression that was very soft and very certain. "Yes," she said, "James." James Thomas Townsend was a serious and curious infant who became, by the time he was walking, a serious and curious toddler with emphatic opinions about which boots he would wear, and a deep fascination with the horses in the Crane Ranch stable. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady temperament, and he regarded the world with the particular focused attention of someone who intended to understand it thoroughly. Olive taught with James strapped to her back in the early months, which Mrs. Fitch declared irregular, and which the students found deeply interesting. By the time he was toddling, Anna Reyes's younger sister Carmen had joined the household as help during school hours, and the arrangement worked well for everyone. The Crane Ranch grew. Tobias proved to be the kind of foreman who turned an operation from adequate to excellent through the particular combination of hard work, good judgment, and genuine care for the people working under him. He hired fairly, including men of Mexican origin, and one Apache man named Silvio who had been born on the Yavapai reservation, and spoke 4 languages and knew every inch of the territory around them. He paid the same rates regardless of background, which was not universal practice in Arizona Territory in 1876, and he said plainly that he would not run a ranch otherwise. There were hard things. There were 2 years in which the cattle market faltered, and the ranch ran lean, and they ate simple suppers, and Olive did not order new books for the school, and Tobias fixed his own saddle gear rather than replacing it. There was a fire in 1877 that took the northeast pasture fence and killed 2 horses, and the week after the fire was a hard week in the house, quiet and tired, and sad in the specific way that loss is sad when it is animals you have known. Tobias did not speak much that week. Olive did not try to make him. She simply stayed close, cooked good suppers, and was present in the way that was more useful than words. There was a dispute in 1878 with a neighboring rancher named Brent Colley, who had begun moving his fence line incrementally into the Crane property's southern pasture. Small adjustments he thought would go unnoticed until they had accrued to something significant. Tobias had noticed from the beginning and had documented it carefully, and when he finally brought the matter to the Territorial Land Office, he had 6 months of records and 2 witnesses and the boundary survey from 1872. Colley backed down with the bad grace of a man who had expected to steal and had been caught at it. Olive handled it the way she handled most of Tobias's professional matters, with interest, practical support, and a complete absence of drama. She proofread his land office correspondence and said the second paragraph was too conciliatory and suggested he remove it, and he had looked at the paragraph and removed it, and the final document had been better. In the fall of 1878, she told him she was pregnant again. He received this news with the same large, quiet wonder as the first time, though with slightly more certainty on the other side of it. He put his arms around her in the kitchen of their house, which by now had 4 rooms and a covered porch that they had added the previous spring, and held on. "Are you happy?" she asked into his shoulder. "Yes," he said, without any qualification. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1879, small and determined, with her mother's coloring and her father's manner of regarding the world with absolute seriousness. They named her Clara, after Mrs. Fitch, who had died the previous winter of pneumonia at the age of 63, leaving a hole in Mariposa Wells that the town was still adjusting to. Olive had wept when Mrs. Fitch died, genuinely and without apology, in the way she wept for things that mattered, and the naming of the baby was its own kind of answer. Clara Townsend turned out to have a personality that was nothing like her namesake's and nothing like either of her parents. She was loud, joyful, chaotic, and deeply committed to her own agenda from approximately the day she began to walk. James, 4 years old and accustomed to being the only small person in the house, regarded her with a mixture of bewilderment and affection that eventually, over the years, became genuine partnership. The school continued to grow. By 1880, Mariposa Wells had expanded enough that the school board, a different school board now, with 2 new members who had been less set in their old ways, approved a second classroom and gave Olive the authority to hire Anna Reyes full-time. Olive had been working toward this for 3 years, patient and persistent and thorough in her arguments, and when the approval came through, she sat in the empty schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon and felt the deep satisfaction of something hard-won. She told Tobias that evening over supper. He listened to the whole account of the meeting and the vote and the faces of the board members, and when she was done he said, "You built that." "Anna built it with me," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but you made it possible." She looked at him across the table. James was doing something industrious with his supper that suggested he was not eating it, and Clara was asleep in her cradle by the window, and the evening was coming in warm through the open door, and Olive thought that this was what it felt like to have a life that was genuinely your own, not the absence of love or belonging, but the presence of both alongside the particular freedom of being exactly who you were. "I am very happy," she said, which was not something she said often because she did not say things casually. Tobias looked at her with the expression she still was not done cataloging, the open one, the undone one. "I know," he said. "So am I." The years turned. The Arizona Territory was still raw and still changing in 1880 and 1881, and the stagecoach robberies and the distant Apache conflicts and the petty violences of the frontier were still real things in the world around them. Mariposa Wells was not immune to the roughness of the age. But the town was becoming more itself, settling into its own contours, and the Townsend household was part of the connective tissue of it. Olive was on the school board by 1881. She had not sought the position, she had been asked, which was a different thing, and she had accepted because she understood that being asked to the table was only useful if you actually sat at it. She used the position the way she had always used the classroom, to make room, to push against the edges of what was considered appropriate, to insist on the dignity of every child who walked through the school's door. The school had 23 students by 1882. Olive could look at that number and trace a line back through all the specific choices and arguments and walnut cakes and chalk deliveries and ordinary Thursdays that had built it. She found she was deeply fond of that line. In the spring of 1882, Tobias and Hollis Crane completed a formal partnership agreement that gave Tobias a 25% ownership stake in the ranch. A negotiation that had taken 2 years and a lawyer from Tucson and a great deal of patient persistence, and which was one of the things Tobias was most quietly proud of. The Crane Ranch, under their joint management, was running 400 head of cattle on good grass, with a reliable working crew and a reputation in the territory for fair dealing that was its own form of currency. Hollis Crane, who was in his mid-60s by then and whose health had deteriorated steadily, sat on the porch of the main house the afternoon after the papers were signed and told Tobias that he reminded him of his son, who had died of typhoid fever at the age of 22, and whose absence was the permanent grief at the center of Hollis Crane's life. Tobias had sat with that for a long time. He had told Olive about it that evening, which he would not have done even a year before because he would have thought it too private. But she was the person he told the significant things to now and had been for years, and he did not think about whether it was appropriate. He simply told her. She had listened, and then she had said, "He is lucky to have you in it." "I think I am lucky to have him in mine," Tobias said. She reached across and put her hand on his arm. "Both things are true," she said. "That is usually how it works." Their third child arrived in 1883, a boy they named Samuel, who came into the world with an immediate and inexhaustible interest in everything around him, and who, by the age of 2, had developed a habit of following his father around the ranch like a small, determined shadow. James, now 7, was attending his mother's school and was the kind of student who made his teacher's life both rewarding and occasionally complicated, because he knew more than she let him think she knew he knew, and he was aware of it, and they had developed a pleasurable ongoing competition. Clara, 4, had opinions about everything and was currently of the view that she should be allowed to attend school immediately, regardless of her age. Olive was handling this with the patience of someone who had been fielding unreasonable demands from small people for several years. Tobias watched his family at breakfast one morning in early 1884, James eating with one hand and reading a school book with the other, Clara holding court on the subject of the neighbor's dog, Samuel attempting to put a biscuit in his ear for reasons that remained unclear, and felt something so full it was almost difficult to contain. He said nothing about it. He drank his coffee and watched them. Olive, across the table, caught his eye and gave him a look that said she knew exactly what he was thinking, because she usually did, and she smiled. It was the smile he had first seen in the amber light of the Agua Dulce relay station, in the first days of their knowing each other, the one she did not manage before it arrived. He had been trying to earn that smile his whole life, he thought, without knowing it. And then a woman in the desert had waved a blue shirt at him, and everything had made sense. In the summer of 1884, 10 years after Olive Redmond had stood in the Sonoran Desert with a near-empty canteen, and waved down a stranger. Mariposa Wells held a 4th of July celebration that the whole territory seemed to attend, ranchers and townspeople and families from 20 miles in every direction. Setting up on the main street with bunting and musicians, and Mrs. Ray's extraordinary food, and a general air of celebratory excess that was entirely appropriate for the occasion. Olive and Tobias stood together at the edge of the main street, watching their 3 children participate in the chaos with full commitment. James was running a foot race with a seriousness of purpose that suggested he had been training for it. Clara had acquired a length of ribbon from somewhere and was using it to direct other children in a project of unclear intention. Samuel was sitting on his father's shoulders, having demanded elevation, eating a piece of dried fruit with great satisfaction. "I want to tell you something," Olive said. Tobias glanced down at her. Samuel's small hand was resting on top of his head. "Tell me." "I think about that morning sometimes," she said. "That first morning, waking up and finding myself alone in the desert." He was quiet, listening. "I was frightened," she said. "More frightened than I let myself show, even to myself, while it was happening. And then I was angry. And then I walked for 2 hours in July heat, and then I saw you on the ridge." She paused. "I wave that shirt every day in my memory." He turned and looked at her fully, Samuel swaying overhead, the noise of the celebration around them, and his face was the open one, the one she had never finished cataloging and never would. "I would stop for you every time," he said, "in any desert." She reached up and took his hand, the one that was not steadying Samuel's knee. He closed his fingers around hers. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why." Around them, Mariposa Wells celebrated its birthday with the enormous, impractical optimism of a place that was still figuring out what it could be. James Townsend won his foot race and announced this to anyone within hearing. Clara's ribbon project had somehow become a parade. Samuel, from his height on his father's shoulders, surveyed all of it with serene satisfaction and ate his dried fruit. Olive Redmond Townsend stood in the summer light of the Arizona territory and held her husband's hand and felt, with a completeness that required no qualification, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had placed her there. Not because the trail boss who had abandoned her in the desert had been part of some design. Not because the desert itself had intended to deliver her to anything. Because she had walked. Because she had waved her shirt at a stranger on a ridge. Because the stranger had stopped. Because they had both, in their own time and in their own way, made the choice to stay. The evening came in long and golden over the desert, the way it always did in summer, and the musicians played something slow and sweet that people drifted toward. And Tobias handed Samuel down to Anna Ray's arms and turned to Olive and offered his hand with the formality and the warmth of a man who had been doing things with intention for long enough that even a dance in the street was a statement. She took his hand and let him lead her toward the music, and they danced on the packed dirt of the main street of Mariposa Wells in the summer of 1884, while their children moved around them in the golden light, while the desert held all of its complicated history and beauty around them, while the stars waited at the edge of the sky for the sun to finish its long exit, and while the life they had built together stood solid and warm and real at their backs. Not a single thread left hanging. Not a single thing undone. Just this, exactly this, the sum of every choice, every mile, every morning, every supper, every argument and repair, every silence and every word said clearly in the right moment. The sum of a man who had stopped when he was supposed to keep riding, and a woman who had been brave enough to wave her shirt at a stranger and trust that something good was coming. It had come. It was here. It was theirs. The musicians played on, and the stars came out one by one above the Sonoran Desert, and Tobias Townsend pulled his wife a little closer in the dance, and Olive Redmond Townsend laughed at something he said quietly near her ear, and Mariposa Wells turned toward its future with the unhurried confidence of a place that had found its people. And the desert, immense and ancient and quietly attending to all of it, held its peace.